They were the first monumental rock and roll act to come out of Nashville, even though their #1 goal was to play the hallowed country stage of the Grand Ole Opry. Two brothers whose voices blended like nothing heard on radio before. The Everly brothers are often mentioned in opposite order, Phil and Don. But Don was the firstborn. He and Baby Phil, as he was first known, were entertaining on the airwaves practically from the moment they could walk.
It took a while for their voices to become what their voices were. But they were, from the time they were kids, their father was training them how to do close harmonies. It was practiced. It wasn't some magical event. They really worked on it. And then it turned out that they were, supremely good at it. Siblings, family members, the voices are so close that 1 + 1 equals more than 2.
Amazingly, it's just now, years after their deaths, that the Everlys story is being told with the depth and discernment it deserves, thanks to Barry Mazor. Barry is one of America's premier music writers who chooses to live here. And if there ever was a story itching for a feature film, I'm putting it out there, this is the one. I'm Demetria Kalodimos, and it's Banner & Company. Well, Barry, thank you for making time for us here.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Great. You hear about farm kids doing chores before school or someone's got a paper route. The Everly brothers were doing entire radio programs before school.
Yeah, and we're talking elementary school. They were still doing it through high school. I mean, on some level, even before the family radio shows, they were performing with their dad live when they were 2 and 4. And we're, in Chicago. So, yeah, and sometimes their friends didn't know, and they maybe didn't want to push them to know because they were doing like hillbilly music and it was already not entirely cool among kids.
Right.
But, yeah, they were doing it right on. When they were 2 and 4, their dad had them out on Maxwell Street where the blues players play in Chicago, and Don's singing with them, and Phil can't sing yet, so he's like dancing around a little, and they're 2 and 4 years old in the 40s, yeah.
Did they think it was fun, or did they realize it was a
Kind of both. It sounds from what I've made of it. It's like a lot of showbiz families that they wanted in. Their dad was already doing it, and Don was a year and a half older, so he actually had his own piece of a weekly show by 1946, I think. So he's 7 years old.
Wow,
little Donnie.
Their dad, though, was a hot guitar picker.
He was. And the thing to understand about that, he was very crucial in developing the Muhlenberg, Kentucky style picking, which, he taught Merle Travis. If you grew up in folk music and have heard of Travis picking, that really goes back to Ike and his buddy Mose Rager. The thing, though, the other mistake with that is to think that they were some kind of big stars and the Everlys walked into it. This was not the Nelson family. She was in Fred and Ginger movies, and Ozzy was a band leader. No, it was always regional. It was always local. It was pretty steady, but not great on the radio. And heck, it became a family show because it paid more to have 4 people on it instead of 2.
Yeah, smart. And it was a heck of a lot better than coal mining.
Oh, yeah. No, I definitely didn't want to do that. Left Kentucky for the same thing. Another misconception is that Don and Phil Everly were raised in Kentucky. Not at all. They left, the family left Kentucky when Don was 6 weeks old. And they went to downtown Chicago for their first 7.5 years, which is not the way people think about them. They were urbanized early. And then the family radio show, when they joined it, was in Shenandoah, Iowa. They were very much products of the Midwest.
Yeah. The mom wasn't necessarily a musical person.
She had learned to play the bass. She was like Ike Everly's next door neighbor when they were young, and they met. Didn't have far to go to meet each other, and she played bass a little, but she was not a singer. This always bothered her because she wanted as much recognition as the others. What she turned out to be was pretty good as the announcer on the show and the MC, and she did commercials. And it's sort of a shame she never pursued that as a career. I always thought she could have been like the down-home Arlene Francis, for people old enough to remember that name, which was radio and TV as a daytime host, but she didn't. She just remained peeved that she wasn't in the act.
Was it evident from the start that the brothers had the blood harmony?
Well, the start being as very young as I said, it took a while to exist. The blood harmony thing, it's thought of as an idea, is that siblings, family members, it could be parents and kids, but the voices are so close that 1 + 1 equals more than 2. Well, first of all, it took a while for their voices to become what their voices were. But they were, from the time they were kids, their father was training them how to do close harmonies. It was practiced. It wasn't some magical event. They really worked on it. And then it turned out that they were, supremely good at it. I mean, a basis of the act was that harmony vocal sound, which they kept all the way through.
Yeah. Did it change at all when their voices changed?
Yeah, what I'm saying is, in a way, it wasn't really there till their voices changed. I've heard tapes of them as little kids, and Phil already has the higher voice, and Don is already the lead singer, which was going to keep going. But they first start to sound like them around 1950. They're like, at that point, they're preteens, 12 and 10, and you can start to hear it's them. It's not the sophisticated sound it would be. There's a lot of shouting involved, but you can tell this is Don and Phil Everly by that point in their life.
Yeah. From a technical standpoint, do they have to look at one another to get the
Well,
phrase?
They always did. I mean, one of the reasons it was so close is that if you can watch, there's loads of video of the Everly brothers because they were a little bit photogenic, people noticed. So from their first performances as the Everly brothers in the 50s, all the way through mid-2000s when they gave it up, there's footage of them, and you can watch it. And Phil has always got his eyes directly on Don's mouth to see where he's going, which got to be an issue and a challenge later on in the history of the group. But at one point, Don made a joke. You see Phil following me, looking at my forehead. That's where we write the lyrics.
I read in the book that they were both left-handed, but forced to play guitar right-handed?
Yeah, their father said that they would never have any jobs if they didn't learn to do it the other way. So yeah, one of the things they were learning out in Iowa, besides singing, besides learning a repertoire, was you were gonna play guitar right-handed, whether you are or not, and they always did.
Yeah. What was the first sort of pivotal break that gave the boys sort of an independence from the family group?
Well, the break was a total change in the situation in broadcasting. The family had the show in Iowa. This is late 40s. So what does it mean? Radio stations are already changing from live performance radio to top 40 DJs, and live is moving to TV. Their attention is moving to TV. And the family wasn't doing that. They found their next and last job as a family outfit in Knoxville. And that was the next move closer to here. Well, an awful lot of people in Nashville got their start in Knoxville because you could do it. There were shows you could do it. They were doing it there. In the course of that, what Don and Phil's music was already beginning to change. There, got to step back slightly on this, which is that even in the 40s, because there was this Everly Brothers album, quite famous, Songs Our Daddy Taught Us, which is very old school country. But that's not all he taught them. From those earliest days, he was also teaching them the Ink Spots, the Mills Brothers, black gospel harmony, white gospel. It was very broad what they had learned to do. it became more country because that's what that early morning farm radio you were talking about.
Yeah, it was the farmers that listened.
So there's that lag in country music that's, got to be a genre in records because there was that lag. At first they weren't on radio. So we're talking, by the time you get to the mid-50s, and they're in Knoxville, and they're in high school, and they're doing shows 7 days a week.
Wow.
But it started to reflect that taste they had for what was being called beat music. It didn't have a name. They said, when we heard early 50s doo-wop R&B groups like the Clovers come along, their harmony was so close to what we were doing, we couldn't see any practical difference. So we just continued to do that stuff amidst what we did. And the farmer radio in Knoxville fired the family because they said, beat music is nice, but it doesn't sell groceries, which is what he wanted to do. So they lost that slot and had to decide what to do next. The parents felt that their possibilities had ended on any large scale. And they kind of announced to Don and Phil, now you're the Everly brothers. There wasn't a lot of thought about it. You do it. And there's one other thing that had happened, which was remarkable, which is that by the age of 15, Don Everly had already sold songs. Kitty Wells had a top 20 song written by Don when he was only 15, 16 years old. Like a lot of people in Nashville, they got the publishing contract, and that meant, come on down, we might be able to do something for you. And at that point, it was Chet Atkins trying to see if he could get them placed. And it followed. They followed. They wound up published by Acuff Rose, 1957. By the way, this is history we're talking about. This will shock people thinking about it. But 2 weeks from today, it's 70 years since the Everly brothers first walked into a recording studio with a single at Columbia where they didn't take. Then it took 2 more years. So this was history when I had to write. Most of the people are gone that had anything to do with those early years. Right through the early hits, no one's left alive now who was anyway involved with those hit records everybody knows. That, when they Bye Bye Love and when it explodes. Ray Edenton from the A-Team was 96, was the last one alive that had anything to do with it, and he died as I was starting the book. So this is history.
It's Banner and Company. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. We'll be right back.
Welcome to Sephora. I'm looking for a perfume that's not too perfumey. I got you.
Serum moisturizer or moisturizer serum.
Let's get into layering.
My concealer is making me look worse.
Sounds like the wrong shade. Let's get you matched.
There's only one store that really gets what you're going for. Get beauty from people who get beauty. Only at Sephora.
Hi, Let's get you a basket.
They came to Nashville. It took a couple years of knocking around and barely eating, truthfully. And when this break came, a bigger publishing deal, a recording deal with it at Cadence Records. And one of the very first thing they recorded was this song nobody had wanted called Bye Bye Love. And it exploded.
Nobody wanted Bye Bye Love.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the verses are pretty conventional country. And they had tried it. Johnny and Jack, the brother-in-law team, had been offered it and thought about it and didn't quite do it. Porter Wagner, who had been recording songs, this song, by the way, is one of the songs by Felice and Boudleaux Bryant,
right,
who are going to become a very important connection for the Everlys. Well, they'd already been successful in town. And that song, Bye Bye Love, they'd actually started to record with Porter Wagner, who'd done a few of similar songs of theirs just before that. And nobody could agree on how to do the chorus. Well, it turned out that if you did it practically as a triumphant football cheer, which is the way they did it, as a kiss-off song with like an edge of rockabilly in it, that worked. And it exploded.
Yeah, yeah.
They got it.
I saw an old Ralph Emery interview with Don, and I guess it took like 33 takes to get the recording that we all know.
Well, the thing about that is they got the vocals. It wasn't very difficult for them to nab a vocal.
Yeah.
But it was just, they said there wasn't something quite right with the record that's going to make it take off. The thing that they had to wait to find was those chords at the beginning, which are pure Don. He'd already had them on an earlier demo record, and he started just playing that in the studio, thinking about it. And the guys in the studio, the multiple producers, the people waiting around for something said, wait, that. Well, Don's slashing guitar chords, riffs, were going to prove to be as important for them as the country harmony vocals. Between them, you get their real contribution to pop music going forward. But as soon as they heard that, they knew it was something. It also had the effect of making it possible. They didn't know it was going to be done. It went to number one country. It went to number one R&B, but the label was also showing it to pop DJs. And they got on their very first tour behind the record. There was a guy, a DJ in Buffalo, who had this tape he played. He played Bye Bye Love at a sock hop. And 2,000 kids are singing back the chorus to Bye Bye Love. Phil said, that's when we knew something was happening.
You think?
Yeah, it was happening.
Back to the guitar riff.
Yeah.
Wasn't Don like captivated by Bo Diddley?
Yeah, he absolutely was. And there was some relation between Bo Diddley's beats and what Don did. But it would be, it's oversimplified to say he just picked up a Bo Diddley beat and turned it into that. He had learned, and I know a lot of music writers thought, geez, this must have come from Mississippi Delta blues. I mean, it's even more pronounced on the second hit, Wake Up Little Susie. That riff is one of the all-time riffs. The Musicians Hall of Fame here gave him a special award just for that riff, because you take that riff, and I tell you, you can watch that at the beginning of The Who, I Can See for Miles. You can see it at the beginning of the Rolling Stones' Jumping Jack Flash. You can hear it between verses on Bob Dylan's It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. It's all Wake Up Little Susie.
Wow.
It was practically metal. And this is what I came to the conclusion working on the book was a major contribution from them. Because when we think about rockabilly of that generation, it's like, if you look at the Carl Perkins or Elvis Presley and band model, what is it in the end? It's R&B-like singing, either because they could do it or they were imitating black singers, and they added country picking to it. And that's what we call rockabilly. The Everlys were doing exactly the opposite. It was country harmonies, which never went away. That was always country. But the guitar was slashing blues-based, and that had a future. Ask the Beatles. It's the basis of their act. And they'll tell you so.
Right. Do you think that came because they really keyed into what their father was doing?
No, in fact, the funny thing about that is their father's picking was very meticulous. They never did their father's picking.
Yeah, you don't see that.
That's not what they did for a living. It's like they never even tried till very late in life to see, could you do that electrically? Well, they always played acoustic on all the records, on all the shows. Very rare for them to pick up an electric guitar, which Keith Richards said that's what made it so darn hard. It's really hard to slash that hard on an acoustic guitar, but they always did. No, that came from their own interest in what they saw in blues. One of the things they saw out there in Chicago in the streets when they were little kids, they saw early on that American folk musicians, and this is true in country and in blues, use these open tunings, varied tunings. Most rock and rollers had no idea about this unless they had that background, and in England, nobody did. So the Rolling Stones first saw that there could be tunings when the very first tour they were on was opening for the Everly Brothers. In fact, they were fifth on the bill. Bo Diddley and Little Richard were on that tour. The Rolling Stones were, who were they? They'd had one single. But so they're watching all this and they realized it. Later, Ry Cooder showed them more. But this idea that to sound like this, you had to do some things people didn't know. But you put those together and it was a major contribution to the way pop music has sounded ever since, because people use that.
Yeah. They're 18 months apart, roughly, I mean, which is basically almost the same age.
Yeah.
Was there sibling rivalry? Was one ever trying to one-up the other, or did they?
Well, sure, they were brothers. I mean, this is half the story of the book. It really turned out to be. It's one half about the music they made, one half about something that had not really been done before at length, which was who were these guys?
Right.
And I found in the course of writing this thing, which was a 3.5-year job, that the relation between those two is about as close as any musicians I've ever written about, and I've written about a lot. Over 50 years now I've been doing it. So there was a very strong relationship between them. Yeah, rivalry doesn't quite get it, because they were equally at home being as close as you hear. But they were very different personalities, very different from each other, and that could clash. The only kind of thing you could see as rivalry is from, high school. You know, Phil would say, I wasn't going to get any girls if I had a 1.5-year brother around from the next class. And there would be things like that were often joking. But the nature of what they did as musicians got to be an issue because of those differences. It was assigned early on and remained that Don is the lead singer. Every time I break into a solo vocal on all those hits records, it's virtually always him. And Phil is always locked into Don hearing. Well, you know, that creates a certain tension in any band. On top of this, Don sold a lot more songs that they did than Phil did. Phil came along, he was a little younger, and his songwriting came along, and he had hits too. When Will I Be Loved, for instance.
That was a Phil hit.
His biggest. But the hit songs from the early going that were not Brian's songs tended to be Don's songs. And, you know, so this creates another thing. It's like, who's going to get the attention and how? And you might have had even management people who would suggest, hey, you know, you could have anybody as your backup singer. So there was deliberate, you know, I mean, Wesley Rose of Acuff Rose was a bit of a finagle, and he made life complicated for them. And one of the things he could do was try to do that on purpose. Now, it wasn't true. It wasn't true. The fact is, Don and Phil Everly together was the hit act. And as they discovered during a period where they worked separately for 10 years, that didn't work nearly as well in terms of people's response to it.
Right.
Which in itself caused tension. Nobody likes to hear that. You know? So all through their adult lives, and even in their obituaries, they were referred to as half of something. Now, I don't know how somebody's supposed to feel about that and for how long, but of course, there were built-in tensions to the situation.
You know, I always notice, too, they're often mentioned in opposite order. It's Phil and Don, even though Don came before Phil. And I don't know if that's just because Paul McCartney sang it that way. Or...
Oh, that certainly helped.
Yeah,
that certainly helped. But why did he say? I think it's easier to say Phil and Don than to say Don and Phil. Your voice stops on the first one. They were never listed that way on labels or anything. It says
but when people
the Everly
talk,
brother. Yeah. I think it just got to be easier to say. And truthfully, most people didn't know which was which and who was singing lead anyhow. Right. So even after you saw them on TV, who's the darker haired one? You know, it's like they lived with that all the time also.
They did something kind of, I'm not going to say sneaky, but interesting when they were in that publishing feud here in Nashville. Didn't they come up with an alias?
Oh, several times. Yeah. Well, the feud was this. 1960, they moved from Cadence Records and based here to being stars of this new label called Warner Brothers Records, which was not very well established. Of course, the movie studio was, and they had this major contract, the biggest anybody had ever seen. It was like $1 million for 10 years then, divvied up over 10 years. But with that, it became clear that Wesley Rose, who had been their publisher and their manager and made all these decisions for him, including many he wasn't asked to make, they were grown men by this point, and they discovered they could be rid of him as their manager, which he was, but he controlled the publishing. And I don't have to tell you what that could suggest. He basically cut them off from all of the Bryant songs and even their own songs. So this is how they started to look for other writers like Harold King on and Crying in the Rain and things. They were cut off from their own material. He did that. And that didn't make him very popular. But, well, that's part of the background to what you're asking about, which is that bad stuff started to happen.
Yeah, and they were caught, though.
Oh,
they were found out.
That was after, a little time went by, and they got tired of this situation, and they started their own little label where they recorded instrumental music and stuff, and they used aliases there. They had a couple of songs supposedly written by some of their wives. They tried all these things. Like he knew. Truthfully, what happened is, after a while, Wesley didn't care as much. I mean, they were still. They'd record some old Hank Williams song, which was definitely A Cup Rose, and he wouldn't say anything. It kind of crept back, and slowly they got back together with A Cup Rose. So, but there was a lot of years where that made big trouble for them.
It's Banner and Company, and my guest is author Barry Mazor, who's written the definitive book on the Everly brothers. We'll be right back. Let's talk for a minute about Barry.
Okay.
You had to be astounded that no one had written this book. How long was this on your wish list?
Oh, well, it was on my wish list a long time, which was different from my deciding to do it. You know, maybe I probably should have. I was listening to them as I go into the book when I was 8 years old, and Bird Dog was on the radio. I mean, you're an 8-year-old kid, but it's funny. You remember that. You like it. And I always paid attention to them. I played them on college radio in when I had a college radio show in circa 1970. And I interviewed Phil here one time when I got here to Nashville. So they'd always been part of Mattering to me. But really, you'd find that so many of the writers who write about American music and American roots music in particular had asked the same question for years, which is, why isn't there a book I can rely on that's sourced and careful and takes a deep dive and maybe says something about the Everly brothers? Of the 10 original inductees in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they were the only ones without such a book, partly because they tended to resist it. But everyone asked the same question. That was the origin of this book. I was online, and my friend Elijah Wald, who's written many books, including the one that became Dylan Goes Electric and the movie this past year, he was saying he was looking for, you go looking for a source you can quote and feel safety. He said, why isn't there one? And I started to talk to him about some of the reasons there might not be. Well, it turns out my literary agent caught this conversation, and he said, well, why don't you write it? and then, why don't I? So that was actually the origin of the book. He's a good agent. But the Paul Bresnik, for anybody listening.
It's listening out there.
So it was actually quite natural for me to do it with that background of caring about them. I was familiar broadly with their very extensive recording work, which in itself took 60 years, almost. So 40 anyway on the labels, but 60 on the radio and all if you go back. So I said I'd do it, and it proved exciting to do.
You grew up in Pennsylvania, I'm assuming consumed by the music of the day?
Yeah, all kinds, although it might surprise people. My family had a certain showbiz background, but it had nothing to do with, God knows, nothing to do with country music or folk and all these things. That's something that I found out that I loved. It was anomalous. People still ask about it. If I tell you, my mother and her sister, when they were 6 and 8 years old, were singing and dancing in vaudeville with people like Cab Calloway.
Really?
Or Baby Rosemary, who people know from the Rosemary. Yeah, she was Baby Rosemary then. And they shouted and they sang. Well, much like the Everlys, there's might be something to this. My mother was more introverted, my aunt more extroverted. My mother just wanted to go home and paint, and she became a painter, as Don almost did, by the way. My aunt went on with it, so by the time I was there and a kid, 10, 11 years old, they were running a performing arts school in New Hope, PA, which is an artist colony. And top dancers and actors in this country and jazz musicians. Charlie Parker's son Bear was my roommate when I was 13 years old.
Wow.
But there's something else. This is how I got into this. Not because I was into jazz or all the endless show tunes I was raised on, and still no. But I don't talk about that much. You just got me. It's beatnik era. It's 1961, 62, and the people who were not musicians, theoretically, actors, a bunch of modern dancers with bare feet, these are beatniks, and they had guitars, and they were playing this folk music stuff, and they started to hear this, and I got into that, and within 3 or 4 years, I'm listening to Hank Williams and Muddy Waters, and I'm going back into what is this, what was this? And so by the time I'm in college, that's what I'm playing as a DJ. So I accidentally stumbled into this. They were playing very sophisticated music, and it turned out I like 3 chords.
Well, it's easier that way and more complicated. Your graduate
Brought me to Nashville.
Your graduate work was in film, though.
That is true. I was a graduate of the NYU Graduate Film School. I cared about film, as some people do, you may have heard, as much as music, and took a real stab at that. I worked for story departments of major studios. I had scripts, both dramas and comedies that kept almost making it at a pretty high level, but they didn't. And it was a good class. I mean, I was in the same class at grad school at NYU as Jim Jarmusch and Tom DeCillo, and these were buddies of mine. My buddy Michael Slovis, who was like close friend. I mean, he was a major cameraman on TV and directed a couple episodes of Games of Thrones. So I'm off doing this stuff, and they're all back there doing that stuff. But yeah, that was part of my background too. It affects how I write. It affected how I write.
In what way?
Because I wanted to be a writer-producer. They didn't have this term showrunner in those days, but that's what it was. You know, you want to be Rod Serling, Patty Chayefsky, those were showrunners. You wrote, you signed other people. So the same kind of editor in print publishing I would be. I saw myself as a writing executive, and who also wrote. So what you learn as a screenwriter about what to focus on in a scene to get at somebody, how to get in and out of them, what to not bother to say. It still shows itself in my writing in a lot of ways. I do get in and out of scenes, and I focus on the action that's going to maybe be the one that you don't have to do 400 other pages. I would really rather do a 300, 400-page book than one of those 2,000-page jobs. It's not my style. So this helps collapse that into the right size, the way I see it, and it moves along.
With that said, and you mentioned your pal who was involved in the Dylan film, is there a movie out of this?
Oh God! Well, that would be interesting. It would feel like going full circle for me if that would happen.
It would.
But there's a problem. I mean, how are you gonna cast Phil and Don Everly? They need to kind of look like that. They can work on that. They need to be able to act, and they need to probably be able to sing and play at least passably. Now, there's many tricks that could be done these days, but I don't know. I think part of the reason it's never come up is because of how difficult that would be. We'll see. Who knows?
There's a Springsteen film coming out in mere
he
days.
Picked the actor I don't know. You never know. There was a TV miniseries on about a year ago about the Menendez brothers. The funny is that those two actors didn't look anything like the Menendez brothers, but it tickled me because they kind of look like Phil and Don. It's just that they don't sing. I would say, those guys, but they don't sing, so who knows? There's people out there. If it happens, people will hear about it, but I have no immediate prospect of that, no.
Has anyone ever come close to that sort of a vocal blend? You listen to so much music, you know who's out there. I mean,
well, so many have tried. Let me put it, the way I look at it is that kind of singing has had continuing influence to this day. Now as much as ever. I mean, you got a half dozen brother or sister, or not even brothers, like the Milk Carton Kids. I mean, there's people out there doing that kind of close harmony. I did a talk about this at the Americana Fest, and I had Larkin Poe with me, two sisters who did that music, did Everlys music beautifully, but also had a lot to say about that life of singing closely and working together. There are a number of these, and there are a number of all Everly Brothers salute albums because that still matters. So, I think one of the things about their harmony is it's a great one. And most acts that do close harmony, including brother acts, do their own version. People compare them probably too much to some of their predecessors in country music who were close. And to my ear, and I think to theirs, each one of them had their own way of doing it. So I don't compare that way, but I certainly hear influence of Everly Brothers in many acts.
Yeah. The one thing I want to back up and just ask you about is the famous, horrible 1973 show that leads to them being...
Yes.
Set that up a little bit.
Well, pressures on the Everly Brothers through the 60s had been difficult. And at one point, they had prescribed Ritalin, which people didn't know too much about to them. This is in the book. They were really very upset. The pressure when the hits stopped coming. What do you do with it? Well, they always do. Look, their hit period was as good as most people have. That 5-6 years. What do the Beatles have? 7? I mean, almost no performers have more than 5-6 years. And if you have comebacks like they did twice, pretty special. Or you last any longer than that, very unusual. They've been through those pressures. They've been through downs through the mid-60s. They made wonderful music then, albums, all kinds of albums. And they'd had that comeback when country rock hit. I mean, Don Everly taught Graham Parsons how to do those harmonies and play the guitar parts on which he recorded with Emmylou. So they had a TV show again in the 70s. They were up, and then it fell off yet again. So we get to 1973. They're grown men with wives and families, and they're on the road hundreds of days a year, practically stapled together on the same microphone, thought of as half of something, one act, one person. And they've started to have somewhat divergent musical ideas, and there's no even outlet for them to do music that doesn't fit this pattern. So there was a lot of pressures. They were going to do a last 2 shows at the Knott's Berry Farm amusement park near Los Angeles. And they did this. And the day of the first of those 2 shows, Don had a few. And he lost, and he really was in no shape for harmony to work. They did about 3-4 numbers. The curtain came down. The audience is full of writers and celebrities and stuff because they announced this was going to be just about the end. And management brought the curtain down on the show. Phil looked at Don, threw his guitar down on the floor, which is what people remembered, and said, the Everly Brothers died 10 years ago. For the next 10 years, they did not record together. In fact, they didn't speak. They were only in the room at their father's funeral, the same room once in the next 10 years. Come 1983, their families, their friends were saying, you can't go on like this. It's your brother. You don't want it to end this way. You're not getting any younger. You really should patch this up. And the Royal Albert Hall was a place where they had performed with their father. They took their parents on one tour of England in 1971. And they brought their father out to play with them the old songs on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall. It was the classiest place and largest he'd ever played, and the audience was really enthralled with it. And so they thought, they both had the idea, and people who wanted to promote them again had the same idea. Everybody said, why don't you go back to the Royal Albert Hall? It means a lot to you. And Don had said, don't even call me, and he called. In 1983, he called. They got back together. They spent months just getting to be brothers again, hanging out here in town, trying out where nobody was looking to see if what it actually sounded like anymore. It's been 10 years. Turned out it could still work. They got it back together. They got a contract for that Royal Albert Hall shows, which was brought to TV in England and here. It was so successful. It was an amazing hot ticket in England, but people hearing this, had probably seen that show somewhere along the line of the Everly Brothers reunion at the, worked fine, started them again, got a new record contract, and beginning in 1984, they were back on the road together for another 20 years.
Banner and Company is a production of the New Nashville Banner. This episode is produced by Steve Haruch and edited by me. The original music is by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. Our final question is in the fishbowl.
Oh, so we don't know what it is till I pull it out here? It's from Steve Norris. What is your
Most unique professional experience?
Oh, that would have been easier years ago. I've had a great many by now. I was raised among performers. I'm comfortable among them. I felt I had some kind of handle on what they want and how they think, which is what I tried to get on the page. And the pleasure has been such a variety of people. I must have interviewed 25 members of the Country Hall of Fame and probably as many members of the Rock Hall of Fame by now, and bluegrassers nobody heard of but bluegrassers, and blues singers who just played a town, not the charts, and historic blue people. I'm on the phone with B.B. King or John Fogerty or sitting with Kitty Wells. I think about these things. I could not have imagined those. And I might say till I came to this town where the possibilities have been for me. It made a lot of things possible. So those are the high points for me, is just being able to hang and talk with and get and ask what I've wanted to ask of people like that.